Welcome back everyone to your second milestone project. So we've now learned enough about Python with object-oriented programming, errors and exception handling, as well as functions, enough to actually start a larger set project. And in this case, it's going to be our second milestone project where we're going to be creating a blackjack game with Python. Now you can approach this project one of a few different ways. First off, if you're still feeling a little bit fuzzy on object-oriented programming, or you need more of a helping hand as you go along for your first large project, what you can do is just code along this project with the solutions lecture. A lot of students really like that approach, especially if they still feel a little bit too new to object-oriented programming. They'll jump straight to the solutions video and then code along with that actual video, and it's a nice way for someone to help guide you on creating a larger project. The second approach is almost the complete opposite, which is just to attempt the project on your own. So we actually suggest that students who feel very confident in object-oriented programming or who just like that extra challenge to, after viewing this lecture, just jump straight to a blank notebook or a blank script and get started. Debug, test things out, and play around with Python to see if you can build the game completely on your own. Then we kind of have an in-between, which is the workbook. So just like the first milestone project, we actually have a full workbook which breaks down the entire project into smaller, more handleable sub-problems for you to basically help guide you along as you attempt this project. And then there's a solutions lecture that goes through that workbook as well. So again, feel free to take the approach that is best suited for you, depending on how you felt with the material that we just covered. So as I mentioned, for this project, you're going to be using object-oriented programming to create a blackjack game with Python. So I want to quickly go over the main idea of the game, discuss how object-oriented programming should be used for this project, and then give you a brief overview of the workbook notebook for this project. So for our version of the game, it's going to be a simplified version of blackjack, where we're only going to have a computer dealer and a human player. And we're going to start with a normal deck of cards, and you're going to create a representation of that deck with Python using object-oriented programming. So let's quickly just go over what our actual game will look like. This is for people who are unfamiliar with blackjack, or if you are familiar with blackjack, we're going to discuss things that we don't need to consider or we'll just ignore for our version of the game. So the very basic concept of the game we're going to implement with Python is that we have the computer dealer and then the human player at the keyboard and a deck of 52 cards. Then what happens is the human player, they have a bankroll, so you can hopefully already start thinking that they're going to have an attribute for their bankroll, just like we discussed when we talked about creating a bank account for our previous object-oriented programming challenge. And from that bankroll, the human player is going to place a bet, indicating whether or not they think they're going to win this set of hands. Then what happens is the player starts with 2 cards face up, and the dealer starts with 1 card face up and 1 card face down. The player goes first in the gameplay, and the player goal is to get closer to a total value of 21 than the dealer does. And the total value is just the sum of the current face-up cards that the human player has. And there's 2 possible actions that a human player can take. They can either hit, which is to receive another card from the deck, or they can stay to stop receiving cards. We're going to ignore actions like insurance, splits, or double downs, which happen in a real casino playing blackjack, but we want a simplified version of this game, so all the player has to be able to do is hit, which is to grab a card from the deck and put it in their hand, and then take a new sum there, or stay, which means stop receiving cards. So for example, they could hit, get a new card, and then they check what their sum is. And remember, they're trying to get closer to the value of 21 than the dealer will. So once the player has gone, their turn has ended, and then it's the computer's turn. If the player is still under 21, then the dealer hits until they either beat the player or the dealer busts. So by bust, we mean that you go over 21. So let's see possible ways that the game can end. First off, if the player keeps hitting before the computer even goes and they go over 21, then they bust and they lost their bet. The game is then over and the dealer collects the money. So that's one way that the game can end, which is the player busting. And this is before the computer dealer even has to go. The second way the game can end is if the computer beats the dealer. So what happens is the human player goes, they start collecting cards, and then they decide to eventually stay. So for example, their current sum is 19. Then the computer dealer goes and they start hitting cards, so they collect cards from the deck. And if they have a sum that's higher than the human players and is still under 21, then the computer has beat the dealer. And then finally, the third possible option that the way the game could end is that the player actually wins after the computer has its turn. So in our simplified version of the game, what's going to happen is the computer dealer keeps hitting until they either beat the human player or until they bust. So eventually what may happen is they keep hitting and then they bust, meaning they go have a sum over 21, and if that's the case, the human player wins, and they actually then double their bet money, and that goes to their bankroll, and we have a happy human player. So let's talk about a few special rules that you're going to have to implement. One is that face cards, such as the Jack, Queen, and King, are going to count as a value of 10. So we're going to be walking you through how to actually create a representation of a deck of cards, and those face cards are going to have a sum value of 10. And then here's the tricky one, is that aces can count as either a 1 or 11, whichever value is preferable to the player. So if you have an ace in your hand, you can either treat it as a 1 or an 11. You can check out the resource links for more explanations of blackjack and more information on that, but what we're going to do now is explore the project itself and the workbook. Let's get started by jumping over to that repository. Okay, so here we are at the repository. If you go to Complete Python 3 Bootcamp, you should see a folder that has the Milestone project. Keep in mind that the numbering might be a little different if we add folders in the future or rearrange things, but the name should be the same, Milestone Project 2. And what we see here are a few notebooks. We have the assignment notebook, and if you click on the assignment notebook, it basically just describes what the blackjack game is going to look like. We create a simple text-based blackjack game, players stand, hit, keep track of players' money. This is basically what I just described in those slides. And then the next couple notebooks is a walkthrough steps workbook. If we check that out, here we see walkthrough steps workbook. It's basically a kind of setup guide to how you should try to approach this project. And these are the basic steps you should follow when creating the game of blackjack. And then if you keep scrolling down, we have cells with some essentially skeleton code here for you to fill in. So you can see we've created a class card for you. We have an empty init method, an empty string method for you to fill out. And then we have step 3, create a class deck, step 4. So this is to help guide you. And it's kind of an in-between between trying to do it all on your own at first or from trying to just jump straight and treat it as a code-along project. Although that's totally fine. Either of those approaches is okay too. We try to give you as many options as possible for different learning styles. So this is a workbook just like you had for the first Milestone project where we slowly guide you through the various steps of creating this game. And at the very end, you're going to have what is essentially just a while loop here that goes through all the steps of the game. Then after that, the other two notebooks, one is the solution notebook that we're going to be going over in the next lecture. And then we also have a solution code notebook, and that's basically all the code that is in this workbook for the solutions in one cell. So in case you prefer using Sublime Text Editor or PyCharm or something that uses a .py script, you can use that solution code. That way you don't need to copy and paste from all the various cells in the workbook. Okay, so that's basically it. Again, you can kind of have 3 approaches here. Treat it as a code-along lecture by just jumping straight to the solutions. And I would recommend doing that if you feel a little uneasy still with some of the object-oriented programming topics. This is pretty much the largest piece of code you're going to be writing so far. So a lot of students tend to prefer that code-along project. The other way you can do it is by going through the workbook itself, the one we just described here, seeing how far you can get, referencing the solutions when you need to. And then the third way for more experienced programmers, maybe people coming in from another language, or people who just want that extra challenge, open up a fresh notebook and just get started and see how far you can go. Again, we're always here to help out in the Q&A forums. If you have any questions, you can feel free to ask there. We'll see you at the next lecture where we begin going over the solutions.